Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the Women's March on Washington. In my previous video, I only really touched on that and some of the issues. I think it's worth another video because this was a very large event. And I think, along with Trump's inauguration, this is going to be one of the defining events of early 2017 because of its sheer scale. Um, the protests are being described as the largest in the United States since the anti-Vietnam War protests of the 1960s, the late 60s and early 70s. Obviously, it's quite difficult to ascertain exact numbers on these things. Between those protests in the late 60s and this Women's March on Washington, and it's going by different names, the Women's March, the Feminist March, the Million Women March, but I think Women's March on Washington is the most commonly used proper noun for this event. But between that time and this, there's been some other big demos. There was the 1995 Million Man March in Washington, which was about African American men pushing for issues they were concerned about. There was then the Million Woman March, sort of in response to that, because the 1995 event had been seen as too male centric. Then there was a big anti war protest of 2003. Certainly, they were the largest anti war protest scene in world history within the United States is tied between that and the Vietnam War protests. But they were a huge event, massive rallies in London, in Rome. So, whatever way you look at it, I think it is fair to say this is a big event. How it compares to others in terms of scale, remains to be seen. Inevitably, there's been a few controversies around this, and I think that's always going to be the case with such a large event. To put things in context, there were demonstrations held in 63 different countries, somewhere in the region of 150 different demos, if not more. Um, Hundreds of thousands of people involved, mostly women, but quite a lot of men as well. So it was a very large scale event. Now, one image that has sort of encapsulated this whole thing is of a young Muslim American woman, Munira Ahmed, who wore a hijab with the stars and stripes. It's got a lot of attention, and the artist Shepard Fairey, who is known for creating the famous Hope poster for Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, he has created an image sort of encapsulating this moment, and essentially has become a personification of the entire protests, which is raising a lot of debate points, let's just put it that way. Um, One of the main criticisms of these protests is the hypocrisy alleged against the organisers. Um, One of the organisers is an American Muslim woman, Linda Sarsour. She's a Palestinian American born in Brooklyn, and there's a lot of controversy flying in her direction because while she's taken part in what may be the biggest feminist demonstration in history, she is supposedly pro Sharia law and actively in favor of Hamas, which to many outsiders is basically a terrorist organization hell bent on the destruction of Israel. Um, my position is that, well, firstly, I'm not going to vilify Miss Sarsour because sometimes there are allegations and there is reality. Now, the website Snopes, which is known for sort of trying to discern truth from rumours, has presented the allegations. They've said that they have contacted Ms. Sarsour, but there hasn't been any response. So it's difficult to maintain to what extent is the allegations true, to what extent are they not true. Certainly, she would appear to have some pro-Islamist leanings. She claims, for example, that her fellow liberal friends don't understand Sharia law and it always has negative connotations. I take the view one country, one law. Even if Sharia is misinterpreted and the extreme aspects of Sharia are utterly indefensible to any civilized human being, they are barbaric. Um, Even if, let's say, the more modern aspects of Sharia are misinterpreted, one country, one law, I believe staunchly in secularism. Now, one issue is that the United States is less secular than some European countries. The founding fathers had "In God We Trust." So America has never really been a secular state in that sense. Um, but that was always based on Christian heritage. Now, given given the connotations of 9/11, given the the role that violent Islamism has played in the world, I don't blame people for raising eyebrows when someone who is so heavily involved in what is supposedly a feminist march actually goes out of her way to make excuses for repression in the Middle East. Apparently, she's also made excuses for the Saudi regime. Now, we don't know all the facts. It may be that her position has been misinterpreted, so I'm not going to just outright vilify her. Nevertheless, these are valid questions, and I think that it is valid to ask them. There is another issue, which is that George Soros has supposedly funded this, the billionaire American Hungarian tycoon. And it's sort of being presented as the battle of the billionaires, Trump versus Soros. Soros is also alleged to be behind the Black Lives Matter movement. Um, I think the controversy in that lies in the fact that, well, this is supposed to be a grassroots movement, but it's being funded by very powerful people. I suppose that's the allegation. One thing I will say, though, and this is sort of in defense of the protests, it's unfair to nitpick some of the more extreme aspects of the protests, and I'm going to touch on that in a second, and to really focus on the organisers while sort of dismissing the scale of these protests. Now, there were protests all over the world, as many as 2 million people involved, and from that, as I understand, not a single arrest. That is remarkable, and that alone deserves some respect. Whatever you think about the protests, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, that in itself needs to be applauded. Because such a large scale event, it's always possible that there could be trouble, but there wasn't. So that in itself deserves some respect. Now, in terms of Soros funding it, certainly that raises some moral issues. Is there an agenda going on behind this that goes well beyond just women's rights? To be fair, I think the march, although the focus was on feminism, there were other groups represented. There was LGBT groups. I'm not going to say LGBTQ because I think that's absurd. That's just being pedantic. But there were other groups involved, and I think that it would be unfair to just dismiss this as 2 million angry feminists. I think there were a lot of people involved in these demonstrations that had genuinely sincere concerns. And I don't think it's fair to dismiss 2 million people as rabid, man hating feminists. The problem was there were some extreme aspects in the protests. There were some man haters out there. There were some intolerant feminists. There was an artist, I forget her name now. She's not that important to me, so whatever. But she's known for her sort of protest songs, and she just got up and had a bit of a rant. Now that sort of thing just doesn't sell at any points to me. It's just, yeah, she's well known as a rapper and a protest artist. For me, that isn't going to sell any message. It's just going to the end of the stereotype that the protest was about angry feminists. Madonna also made a controversial statement in which she said she wanted to blow up the White House. Now, she has said that this was taken out of context and it was satirical, and a lot of people have defended her. My only question would be, well, okay, if you have a large scale protest, say against Obama or a Democratic president, and let's say someone like Ted Nugent, who, by the way, I have little time for, I don't much like the guy, but that's beside the point. He's a right winger. Let's say, oh, I want to blow up the White House when Obama was in it. I think it's fair to say that the left would be up in arms. They would say, look at this intolerance coming from the right. So people need to be very aware of their double standards. In other words, if you're saying it's okay for a big singer who's has a lot of left wing politics to say something like that because it's satire, then you have to have the same standards if a right winger said that about a left wing politician. And I think the left is showing an enormous amount of hypocrisy and double standards in what they say is okay and what isn't. That's abundantly clear. Also, I say there was no arrests, but that doesn't mean there wasn't any intolerance going on in these rallies. In Actually, it's not technically true. There was at least one arrest. In one of the Canadian demos, there was a group of left wingers. Apparently, they were organised by Canadian left wing party. I forget which one, but the the conservative group Rebel Media had a journalist to go and cover the event. Now, from her testimony, she seemed to be very reasonable. Apparently, she hadn't gone there with any pro-Trump slogans. She hadn't went to shit stir. She simply went to cover the event. Now, what happened, and there's video footage of this, is that she got into a verbal confrontation with some of the protesters because she was trying to film and they were basically taking issue with that. But from what I could see from the video, she wasn't being aggressive. She wasn't, trying to provoke people. Anyway, this guy actually turned around and thumped her camera, and I assume that she was hurt because the camera would have went back into her face. Now, immediately the feminists there, instead of condemning him, they immediately went to his defense. One of them said, "Oh, let's just calm down." Imagine, just imagine, had that been reversed. Let's say, for example, there was a men's rights protest, and there was a reporter from a left wing group. And let's say, for the sake of argument, one of the men assaulted that reporter. It would be absolutely plastered everywhere. Thug attacks woman reporter. How is this any different? You cannot escape the irony that this is a feminist demonstration for women's rights. A male activist assaults a female reporter, and yet they don't really care. They would just say, "Oh, let's all calm down," and they didn't say, you can't do that, or anyway, he ran away like a coward. I am pleased to say he was subsequently arrested, so we can discern that there was at least one arrest from these demonstrations. But for me, that just sums up the hypocrisy of the left. And I looked at the video with an open mind. I'm not affiliated with Rebel Media. I don't even know much about them. But the reporter in that, she seemed very reasonable to me. She didn't seem like she was forcing her views on anyone. She didn't seem like she was going there to cause trouble. And she was assaulted, which is unacceptable. Um, so the left really need to watch their double standards. That's a big sticking point. Also, the ties with Islamist groups in these demonstrations, again, that's a major contradictory issue. If you look at the way women are treated in many Muslim countries, and I know there are Muslim women who really get defensive about this and deny it, but it is a fact that in parts of North Africa and parts of the Middle East, under Islamic jurisdictions, if a woman is raped, she is accused of adultery, right? This is an inescapable fact. She is accused of adultery, and in the most extreme cases, she may face stoning. Now, if you call yourself a feminist and you don't condemn that, or you overlook that, I despair. It's one of my main critiques of Western feminism that there is this strange coddling to Islamist groups, and it's because both groups detest Donald Trump and the American right. So it's almost like they've allied just for convenience. The irony is these feminist campaigners in most Islamic states, they would be absolutely not only shut up, they would actually be facing charges for subversion or for breaking moral codes or worse. So I'm not saying that the issue here is about criticizing Trump. For me, the issue is about a lack of consistency. And a lot of the protests against Trump seem to be based on this Access Hollywood tape. Now, I've said it before, I'll say it again. What he said in that video was a complete disgrace. And his excuse for it, high school banter, was, what was it, locker room talk, was again a bit of a cop out. And I would challenge other men who say that was okay. I don't think it was okay. Um, Even his running mate, Mike Pence, took issue with that. So it was inexcusably a thing he should not have said. But it was 12 years ago, and he did apologize. And I also think there's a difference between saying something and acting on it. Now, Trump is currently facing lawsuits for possible sexual harassment and worse. Certainly, those need to be pursued. I don't think that because he's powerful, he should be, above scrutiny. But again, Bill Clinton has had many allegations against him, and Democratic women and feminists don't seem to hold the same level of wrath against Bill Clinton. It just seems hypocritical to me. Um, so I'm not saying that there is no issues to be had with Donald Trump in relation to women, but I just question the priority with this, and I also question how these protests went about. Now, of course, there's another line to be had. There's another way to look at it, which is if it was only sort of left wing feminists involved, the movement would be accused of not being inclusive. So I suppose there is that counterpoint. Um, and there were a lot of people involved for a lot of different reasons. The Kenyan demonstration, it was about the rights of maids. But I'm a little bit suspicious of the fact that it came immediately after Trump's inauguration, so it was all aimed at the President of the United States, as if he and he alone is the only person in the world that either has a questionable track record on women or has power to do something about it. You know, these problems and women's rights issues is universal. So if the focus of the demonstration had been about women's rights worldwide, that I could sort of understand, although it's still question timing. Um, but you know, I still believe that Western women are among the most relatively privileged people in the world. Am I saying things are perfect? No, but certainly compared to what their sisters go through in certain parts of the world, yeah, I would say they are privileged. And it is notable that most of these demonstrations were in countries which actually already have strict legislation against gender discrimination. So you can't escape the irony of that. Um, I supported their right to protest, and I still support that right. And it was overwhelmingly peaceful. That is a democratic right. Donald Trump has said he supports that right. But those people saying he's not my president, he will never represent me, etc. Okay, I understand emotions run high, but do you really think it's going to be productive if over the next 4 years it's just going to be a case of trying to block every single thing for the sake of it because of personal animosity towards the president? This is the problem that every president faces, frankly. Obama had the same issue with partisan Republicans and partisan right wingers who wanted to oppose him just for the sake of opposing him. If people are really interested in building bridges, then actually the public has a responsibility as well. So I support the right to protest in that way. And you know, that should teach those anarchist thugs the day before a thing or two about how to protest. But I don't know. I just question what the priority of it was because it seemed to be aimed at Donald Trump when a lot of the women involved in this protest were, you know, coming from a point of basically being apologists for Islamist repression. Now, in terms of Munira Ahmed and the Stars and Stripes hijab, I will say this about the hijab. I think it's very different from the niqab and the burqa. I do believe there is a big difference. I have a friend in Canada, and she wears a hijab. I don't see her as an extremist, and certainly in the dialogue I've had with her, she's always come across as respectful and reasonable. She doesn't sort of push her values onto me, although she would have difference of opinions on things. So I don't think the hijab in itself is a major issue compared to say the niqab or the burqa, and I do think it's important to differentiate because with the hijab you can see someone's face, so there's no communication barrier. Also, the fact that she was willing to wear the stars and stripes, and surely that's better than a niqab wearing woman who's going to burn the American flag. You know, this is someone who clearly has affection for the United States, but also identifies herself as a Muslim, and that's how she does so. So I think we have to be careful not to get mixed up with Islamists and Muslims. There's a It's very, very important not to fall into that trap, and I think some on the right do. Certainly, I believe it's totally legitimate to criticize Islam and question whether or not there's a place for wearing the hijab. But I I don't really agree that there should be an aggressive push against the hijab. I believe that's different from the niqab and the burqa. I really do. Because for me, the hijab is not any sort of communication or integration barrier. You can see someone's face. You can communicate. Now, the niqab, it closes communication because you can't see someone's mouth, you can't see their face. That's going to cause obvious problems. As for the burqa, that's just a completely repressive disgrace. And anyone who tries to make an excuse for that are going to make a fool of themselves, because the burqa, is a favorite tool of the Taliban to control women. So I think there's a massive difference between the hijab and the burqa. So I'll leave it there. If you were involved in the protest, let me know what your motivation was. I totally support your right to be involved. If you consider yourself a feminist, do you agree that someone can believe in women's rights without calling themselves a feminist? Do you agree that equality should also mean equal responsibility? In other words, if a woman commits a crime, she should be held to account. Do you agree that men also face issues disproportionate to their gender? So that's all I'm asking. I don't think all feminists are man hating extremists. And certainly I don't think it would be fair to dismiss this huge demonstration as a bunch of angry, feminists. But I certainly think there are valid questions. Now the Women's Equality Party was involved, um, which is a British political party, that in my view is divisive by its nature because it's only focusing on half the population. Of course, they were involved. My question to the leader would be, well, okay, you're pushing for women's rights. Are you going to be on the forefront of condemning Islamist oppression of women? If I could meet the leader of the party, I would be asking her that. I would say, are you going to condemn this unreservedly? And are you going to take a frontline position, because you, as a Western woman, are in a position to do that? So I think these are all very legitimate points. If you were involved in the protest, let me know your thoughts. If you're against them, let me know your thoughts. To be clear, I am not entirely against the protests. I do think that there is a legitimacy there, but I do question some of the mixed messages that were being sent out and some of the priorities that appeared to be contradictory to women's rights. Um, And that's it, really. Let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching.